All right. Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today is going to be an awesome day. We're continuing on with my Shroud Wars panel review sessions. And if you remember on our last panel review, we were looking at the proto-photo hypothesis. I think that was just me and Hugh on that one, and kind of refuting why those types of mechanisms are insufficient to explain the Shroud images. And today we're going to be switching to the heat-based models, things like the Scorch hypothesis or Dr. Colin Berry's, I call it the Toastograph hypothesis. There are other names for it and stuff like that. But yeah, I'm excited because I think of the ordinary artistic mechanisms, I actually think Colin Berry's is the best mechanism. That doesn't mean it's good, in my opinion. I think it fails, but it is the best of the artistic mechanism. So I'm looking forward to having Bob and Hugh explain to me why that shouldn't be the case, why it fails, because they both disagree with it. But before I get into that, let me introduce the guests. So immediately to my right, we have everyone's favorite Shroud skeptic, Hugh Farey. Hey, Hugh.
Hi there. Oh, I'm back to front. Oh, there we are. I was trying to find a hand that I could wave to people. It was off screen.
Welcome back. Awesome. And joining us for the first time in a long time, it's been a while since you've been on a panel review, we have Bob Rucker. Hey, Bob.
Hello.
Awesome. And just for the audience, do you want to just take a couple minutes? What have you been up to? Because I know you've attended some interesting conferences in the meantime.
Well, my wife and I spent 3 weeks in Italy. We spent time in Milan, Rome, Turin, and Brescia, which is east of Milan. I spoke 5 times to about 160 people, including one Zoom that went around the world to 78 different people.
Wow. Amazing. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I remember you kind of sent me the link for that and stuff, and I was really impressed. So that's awesome to hear. So yeah, with that said, let's get into starting off in today's topics. First, I just want to look at the kind of traditional Scorch hypothesis of someone like Pesce Delfino. And essentially, he just posits, look, we had a bas-relief, or others might posit a statue or something, but bas-relief seems better. And you apply heat, and that scorches the cloth and creates the Shroud's body images. And presumably afterwards, you would paint the bloodstains on and that sort of thing. So that, in a nutshell, is what the Scorch hypothesis is traditionally. I guess I'll go to Bob Rucker first on this one. Bob, what's your kind of, for the next 10 minutes or so, whatever you want to do, what's your take on the traditional Scorch hypothesis of Delfino?
Yes. Well, before I get into the specifics, what I'd like to say would be that it seems like a lot of people have very low criteria for producing the images on the Shroud. They think that any mechanism that can produce discoloration on cloth thus disproves that the Shroud was a fake. And that's not true. There are many different scientific qualities of the images on the Shroud of Turin, every one of which has to be satisfied in order to find a mechanism whereby it could have been produced. Now, if you look at the typical type of thing that people produce images, usually of the face, using these various mechanisms, but the very best mechanism that's ever produced an image of the face, an artificial image of the face, was in a paper by C. Donnett and 5 others. The title was 2D Reproduction of the Face on the Turin Shroud by Infrared Femtosecond Pulse Laser Processing. These 6 different individuals used a femtosecond, not an ultraviolet laser, but what's the other option? Not a visible laser either.
Infrared.
Yeah, thank you. Infrared laser. A femtosecond is 10 to the minus 15th second. That'd be 0 point and then 14 zeros and a 1. That's the fraction of a second that this pulse laser used. And it produced a good image of space, at least in a macroscopic sense. Now, there's two different categories of evidence for the images on the shroud. One would be macroscopic and the other would be microscopic. Macroscopic is just how it normally looks to the human eye. Microscopic is getting into the very small details of the what is causing the image actually on the threads and fibers. So what this paper does is that it proves that the very best face on the shroud is produced by radiation controlled by information. That's what this paper does. And so that anyone else who comes along and says, well, gee whiz, I can take a fried egg and fry it on a piece of cloth and produce an image, a discoloration on the shroud, therefore, this is how the image on the shroud was made. Well, no, look at the best option. Fried egg, in a frying pan laying on a piece of cloth, it might discolor cloth, but it's not going to produce the characteristics that's on the shroud. And so you have to compare with the best option, which is this. And this was produced by radiation controlled by information. Well, now that's interesting because my recent paper number 34 on my website, shroudresearch.net, paper 34 on shroudresearch.net, it took 27 different characteristics of the shroud in order to do a bottom-up analysis. All other options are top-down as far as I can see, where they start with some kind of an idea for image formation. But I started with the evidence and then take step by step, consider each of the 27 different evidences for image of the characteristics on the image to derive what I think is the best option for image formation on the shroud. And lo and behold, I came up with radiation controlled by information, the exact same conclusion that these 6 individuals came up with in 2019. So it's a very detailed process to evaluate whether an image formation hypothesis that's proposed is adequate, because any proposed image formation hypothesis has to be consistent with all the scientific evidence that exists on the Shroud of Turin. And in my paper 34, I used 27 different evidences, and there's perhaps more. I mean, Giulio Fonte has papers out that do a very extensive analysis on characteristics of the shroud image. But any image formation proposal has to be consistent with all the evidence. And beyond that, it has to make predictions that are testable and falsifiable and preferably unique. And most of these other image formation hypotheses don't make predictions, and they really don't go into much depth, if at all, in considering whether they're consistent with the scientific evidence that we have from the Shroud of Turin. So that would be my introduction to the whole issue. So I'm going to be putting together a paper. I think I'll call it paper number 37 on my website, Criteria for Judging Image Formation Hypotheses for the Shroud of Turin. So based on that, I've developed 12 different comments where the general Scorch hypothesis fails to satisfy the criteria to be consistent with all the evidence.
Okay, awesome. And just so the audience knows, Bob prepared a 6-page document on the Scorch hypothesis and also addresses Colin Berry's. I'm going to be posting that on my blog for people to go and read after the show as well. But Hugh, so before we get into the discussion and get into some of the details, what's your kind of general introduction and take on the traditional Scorch hypothesis from someone like Delfino?
I some years ago spent a great deal of time scorching bits of cloth and found that it was relatively easy to get the 3D characteristics. It was relatively easy to get the negative characteristics, and it was relatively easy not to let the scorch go all the way through the cloth. The trouble is, I did it with a small 4-inch square little intaglio brass of a dragon, and I am absolutely certain that I would have found it extremely difficult to do something similar using a life-size a life-size model to start with, or even a series of panels which could have been applied a bit after another. But the real reason that I found it difficult that in the end I abandoned that sort of an attempt was that any kind of scorch, to my mind, each time it produced a very bright UV fluorescent band around the scorch. So if, for example, you went to extremes and got a large, say, a dripped molten lead onto a piece of cloth, and then turned all the lights out and shone a UV light on it, you get a black hole where the lead's gone through and some very black scorch marks, and around it you get this extremely bright fluorescent halo. And so my next plan was to try and see, could I make the scorch so dim that the halo was really dim as well? But unfortunately, I couldn't. The halo was always brighter than the scorch. And in fact, even you could even scorch a cloth in such a way that you couldn't see that it was any different from an unscorched piece of cloth, but you still got the ultraviolet glow first. So the ultraviolet glow comes before any visible scorching. And that's obviously not a characteristic of the Shroud. Now, I haven't really looked into it recently. I suppose I could go back and find my old scorches and see, and this is something that somebody suggested, I can't remember who, and see if they're still ultraviolet, still responsive to ultraviolet light as they were 5 or 6 years ago. But to my shame, I haven't done that, mostly because I've only just thought of it just now. But so that was my real problem with the scorch hypothesis, and that's I should say that's a hot scorch hypothesis involving heat, rather than say a chemical scorch hypothesis, which I suppose isn't really a scorch at all, but a discoloration due to acids, or in fact, I think somebody's been trying with sodium hydroxide, which produces a discoloration as well.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. And yeah, we got Teddy Pappas in the audience. She's kind of confirming what Hugh was saying about when you're converting a scorch in terms of giving a full life-sized image, right? You got to worry about these hot spots on the frontal and dorsal body image, and you've got to worry about the fluorescing under the UV light. So she's kind of confirming what some of the problems he was mentioning there. So yeah, I think at this point I want to kind of open it up for you guys to have a discussion and look. So Bob mentioned he had at least 12 points, or that the Scorch hypothesis fails to explain, and Hugh mentioned some. So you guys kind of want to go back and forth about what are some of the physical and chemical properties of the Shroud that the traditional Scorch hypothesis just can't explain.
I'd like to let Hugh go ahead first.
Sure.
because I have so many, and I'd like to give you the chance to give yours.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes, for me, it is, as I say. In fact, I might try and creep in and see if I can burrow into my box here and see if I can find some of my Scorch experiments. But yes, it would be the ultraviolet glow that would be the principal objection. Just in terms of actually what you can do yourself at home. And over the long term, I mean, Teddy's absolutely right. I can imagine it being possible nowadays to come up with some fairly complex laboratory controlled heating underneath a large brass bas-relief or something like that. But I can't see that it would fit into any kind of medieval hypothesis that would be possible. So that's that. So yes, I agree with Teddy's points. Actually, it's just what she's just flipped up on the screen.
Okay, all right. So
can I go through mine then?
Yeah, go ahead, Bob. I'm just going to pen and paper.
I'll make some notes while you're doing it. So if I'm not here, I am listening.
Okay, so the process that I've done is that on my paper 34 on how I believe my hypothesis for image formation, on my paper 34 on my website, I go through evaluation of 27 different scientific evidences from the Shroud. So I just thought through, I read and thought through these 27 different evidences, and I came up with 12 different problems for a Scorch hypothesis. And so number one out of those 12, Stirp concluded the images were not caused by a scorch from a hot object. This is because the images did not fluoresce under ultraviolet light. This conclusion directly contradicts any Scorch hypothesis. Number two, there's a smooth gradation of discoloration on the Shroud from points vertically closer to the body relative to points vertically further from the body. For example, the Shroud would have rested on the tip of the nose, but it would not have been in contact with the nostrils as it goes down the side of the nostrils. And yet there is a smooth gradation of discoloration down the nostril. And so that just contradicts a Scorch hypothesis, because a Scorch hypothesis assumes contact between the body and the cloth in order to transfer heat to the cloth. And so that would scorch the tip of the nose, but would then have no effect on the smooth, to create the smooth gradation of discoloration down the side of the nose. So that this smooth gradation is not consistent with contact between the Shroud and a hot object, such as in a Scorch hypothesis. Number three, the image of the face is a normal width for a human face. If the Shroud were draped around the face on a hot statue, the face on the Shroud would be much wider than a normal face when unwrapped from the statue. And that's not the case. Number four, the Shroud does not include images of the sides of the body or the top of the head. A statue hot enough to scorch the front and dorsal images would probably also form side images, which are not present on the Shroud. Scorch, number five, Scorch would go through the thickness of the cloth very rapidly, in about a tenth of a second, I believe, is one experiment. So there would be an image on both sides of the cloth. This is contrary to the Shroud. Now, when I say both sides of the cloth, I'm saying that on the side of the cloth that would be facing the body and on the side of the cloth away from the body, that there would be a very discernible image on both sides of the cloth, both for the front image and for the back image. Yet that is not the case. Number six, the images on the Shroud are caused by fiber discoloration in only the top 2 or 3 layers of a fiber in a shred. A Scorch would discolor all the fibers in a thread. This is the issue of superficiality. You cannot maintain superficiality in a Scorch. Number seven, the threads in the image are discolored in a mottled pattern. Very interesting on the Shroud, but this is not true of a Scorch. It's the mottled pattern of discoloration on the Shroud of Turin that forms the images of the front and back images of a crucified man on the Shroud of Turin. How in the world do you explain that? I do so in my paper number 34. Number 8, the discoloration on an image fiber has a thickness of less than 0.2 micrometers, with the discoloration around the outer circumference of the fiber, with the inside of the flax fiber not discolored. This is not true of a scorch. So how in the world do you explain that phenomenon? And I do come up with a way to explain that in my paper number 34. Number 9, there are images of bones on the shroud. I think that's clear. This is not true of a scorch. Number 10, the images on the shroud contain 3D or topographical information related to the vertical distance from the body to the cloth at each point. And this is not true of a scorch. Number 11, in the images on the shroud, the top threads facing the body create a non-discolored region on otherwise discolored threads that are beneath them, like a shadow of the top thread on the under thread. This would not be true of a scorch because of how rapidly the heat would be transferred across the thickness of the cloth. And number 12, there are multiple bright spots on the mustache. Now, I don't know if this has been mentioned before by Shroud researchers, but I think this is significant. And I go into how that was formed. But this is not explained by a scorch. So those are my 12 areas where a scorch would disagree with the evidence and thus not be possible to produce the images that are on the Shroud of Turin.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah. Hugh, over to you. Is there anything, any one of Bob's points that you want to engage with?
Just one or two. There's an awful lot of what would or wouldn't happen as opposed to what you've actually done. If you heat up a spoon with an electric heater or something like that, and just brush it over the surface of a cloth, you can certainly restrict any discoloration to the very topmost surface of the cloth. It doesn't go through. It doesn't necessarily go through at all. I think it was essential to some of Ray Rogers's ideas that the thermal conductivity of linen is extremely low. And although heat is mostly or can be convected around the sides, there's no particular reason why, if it's done quickly enough, a heat should go all the way through to the other side, or presumably with a low enough intensity. Having said that, that would be a real problem for a medieval forger to be able to sear, as it were, the top layer of a cloth without it going through. Now we've got another one. There was quite a lot about what would happen if you put a cloth over a hot bronze statue, and I quite agree with that. Colin Berry's experiments involved just his hand, which of course is relatively flat, and he did a bit of experiment with his face, but he only used just the very, as it were, superficial part of his face, and I can't remember what happened with the nose. But basically, a truly three-dimensional statue would certainly produce the famous Mask of Agamemnon face when it was folded out to the sides and all that. But then nobody, I think, must be very few people of the medieval hypothesis field think that an actual statue was involved. I mean, even the experiments that I've done myself have been done with bas-reliefs rather than with the whole statue. So the idea that there's no scorching down the sides, there wouldn't have to be scorching down the sides if you didn't use a properly three-dimensional statue. Another one that I've got here at the top was the graduation, and scorch marks certainly do produce a graduation. There is a contact scorch, as Bob says, but there's also scorch around the sides, which is not contact, provided the object is close enough to the cloth. I did fish around and find something, and that is, just here. this is a piece. This is a key, and you'll agree that it's probably not very much like the Shroud, but you can certainly see that there is continuous graduation from being quite brown on the high points, fading off. Oh, am I doing the right place? Yes, fading off to a more yellowish color out to the side. So the graduation in exactly the same way suggested by the radiation hypothesis, even if they're not the collimated radiation hypothesis, there is graduation out to the sides, which will produce a kind of a 3D effect. So I think those are the three main points that I picked up from Bob's 12 points, and I think that I can produce those. I agree with him about the 3D statue. I don't agree with him with the scorching. Scorching does have variation of color, and I don't agree that scorching cannot be superficial. But apart from that, I think that's about right.
Okay, so Bob, yeah, you heard kind of Hugh has about 3 objections to the points that you made. What's your take on some of these? For example, if they used a bas-relief instead of a statue, would that solve some of the issues and yeah, some of the other stuff that Hugh said about the gradation and superficiality there?
What's the difference between a bas-relief and a statue?
A bas-relief is almost flat. If you imagine getting a body lying flat, the difference between the top and the bottom is probably something like 9 inches. But if you imagine just squashing it so the whole thing's flat, and basically you're just carving it out of a plank of wood, so that the total height difference is perhaps an inch rather than 12 inches.
I'm just going to share my screen to show you guys.
Got a picture of one, or yeah.
Okay, so here's an example of a bas-relief. So you see, it's semi 3D. So
yeah,
that makes sense.
So what have we got there? Yes, exactly that sort of thing. So we have there a horse lying on its side, but it is not even to scale. It hasn't got its third dimension is considerably reduced. Even if it's fairly accurately modeled in width and breadth, its height out of the plane of the plaster is very, very small. And that's true of all the other things that you can see there. Incidentally, if you can just hold that for a moment, Dale,
sure.
Can you see the one that's on the right-hand side, the ancient Roman bas-relief significant examples?
So different image?
The one that your cursor is currently on.
Yeah.
Now, that seems to be rather nicely molded, so that the contours, although they're not fully realistic, they are nevertheless, it's not just a question of being either flat or not flat. Now, if you slide your cursor out to the left by about 6 inches to where it says Horse Polo Art Gallery.
Horse Polo? I don't see what you're talking about.
It's keep out to your index, to the all the illustrations on the side. Move your cursor across,
okay,
and further across, a little bit more to there. No, back a bit, and back a bit. One more. Oh. There. Now that seems to me. Do you see how in this case it's got very little in the way of contours? We've either got it cut out or not. Now, if you tried to make a scorch from that, then you would simply get either contact or no contact. But if you tried to make a scorch from the first one, assuming it was made of brass and not made of plaster, then you're much more likely to get graduations where the cloth didn't quite meet the surface. Do you see what I mean? The difference between the two. One looks much more like a wood block cut out, and one looks much more dimensional with curves. Am I making any sense at all?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Cool. You want me to stop sharing, Bob? Or
yeah, I think my general response to the issue of gradation here is that yes, you can, on a very small scale, you can take a piece of cloth and you can heat it very rapidly, so as to create an apparent gradation in coloration around where you actually touched it. But that should not be understood as being proof that you could easily make the image of the face on the shroud. You would have to, it would be a very involved process to use that technique. You'd have to use computer technology and various temperatures. It would be extremely difficult to use that technique to create the detailed, smooth gradation that we see on the Shroud of Turin, so that it could not be done prior to computer technology.
Well, I don't know if you've read Colin Berry's version where he's tried things with his hand, and he's tried it with his a little brass toy robot that he had. But actually, he's come up with quite good versions of 3D representations of them.
They're extremely, I would say they're extremely erratic and laughable. That's how I would describe it. They're not realistic at all. And the evidence is that if this were so easy to do, that it could be done in the Middle Ages, back about 1325 or so, which was the midpoint of 1260 to 1390, then why have the most intelligent people with decades of effort trying to reproduce this, they have not produced a good image of the face? Whereas computer technology and a femtosecond laser has produced a good image of the face when controlled by information. That's the technology was not available in the Middle Ages to do it. They didn't have femtosecond lasers, and they didn't have a way to control it using information.
Well, no, absolutely true. But on the other hand, I don't necessarily think that you need a femtosecond laser and all that. I don't think that anybody, except possibly myself, has actually tried to make any of these scorches on cloth. To be honest, I've not seen anybody publish anything that resembled the sort of thing that I was working on myself. And as I say, the reason I abandoned it was not because I couldn't do the superficiality, I couldn't do the 3D, and I couldn't do the negativity, because I can do all of those. What I couldn't do was get rid of the ultraviolet fluorescence.
Yeah.
Now, oh, sorry, Bob, were you going to respond?
Yeah, I just think the difficulties are insurmountable.
One thing I want to ask about, because one thing I didn't hear you guys mention, and Teddy asks about body image uniformity. And she says, in what practical way could scorching remain superficial across the entirety of the cloth? And then afterwards, she says the use of a hot spoon isn't very feasible in achieving a 98% uniformity of colors. So she's kind of qualifying for you, Hugh, because I know you deny that, but you do accept body image uniformity within a certain degree, like, plus or minus a couple percent degree there. So how would scorching do on body image uniformity?
Not very well. Certainly not using a hot spoon. I don't think it was done by using a hot spoon. But I mean, I don't think it was done by a scorch at all, because for all the reasons that we've already mentioned. But the main reasons why I don't think it was done by a scorch are more to do with my own practical attempt and the ultraviolet, rather than particular things. I'm just trying to find a little while ago, and a wonderful chap who used to be involved with the British Society for the Turin Shroud for a while, a chap whose name is Hugh Duncan. Okay. He produced a very small but a full-length shroud image using a soldering iron. And I'll see if I can get hold of that. Perhaps while
you're looking it up, Bob.
And I took his photograph and subjected it to the through an image J to make a 3D version of it, and I thought it came out rather well. And of course, we have to remember that anybody who's working with a model which is that big, the ups and downs are very small and very tight. The shroud being, funny enough, it would be easier to produce a more realistic looking thing from a large model than it is with a very small one. Your problem there, as Teddy suggests, is the problem of hotspots and so on.
Yeah, if it were so easy to create the front and dorsal images on the shroud using a Scorch technique, then I suggest that people then produce it and thus win $1 million, because that's the offer that's being made, and it's available. $1 million is available if you can produce images of the front and back of the Shroud of Turin. Of the person that's imaged on the Shroud of Turin. I think $1 million is worth working toward. That's many years of a typical person's work. What would it be? 10, 20 years, whatever, how much they normally make. But why not just do it if it's so easy?
No, Bob, out of curiosity, what's your take on the body image uniformity? That issue. Would that be just a total failure with a regular Scorch mechanism?
Well, what exactly do you mean by uniformity?
So number one, each individual fibril is uniformly colored, plus or minus a couple percent. So it's the same intensity of color on each individual fibril. And secondly, there's also maximal color densities on the front and the dorsal side are the same. They're uniform as well.
Yeah. So that the quality of the front image and the dorsal image is the same. So therefore, I conclude that the front and the dorsal images were made by the same process. Okay, I think that's evident. And so in my explanation for the Shroud of Turin, it's radiation being emitted from the body, charged particle radiation, probably protons, so that the protons were emitted within the same extremely short radiation burst that the neutrons were emitted, so that the protons created the front and dorsal image simultaneously, because they were directed up and down, oscillating between the two. So the front and dorsal images were created simultaneously, and the neutrons that were emitted at the same time shifted the carbon date forward from the true date by absorption in nitrogen-14, creating new carbon-14 on the cloth.
Gotcha. So in terms of the Scorch mechanism, unlike the radiation hypothesis you propose, it wouldn't be able to account for this feature or this physical aspect in your view, I guess.
Well, you'd need a computer to control it.
Yeah, no, I don't think they had computers in the medieval ages.
No, I don't think so. That's why I said the problems are insurmountable.
Okay. All right. So one thing, Hugh, I know you were trying to find something. I'm going to go to the issue of the UV fluorescence, but first I'll let you. Did you want to show us something to do with the image J, right?
Yeah. Hang on. I think I've got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in your view, Hugh, you are saying that the traditional Scorch method can account for the three-dimensionality of the Shroud images. That's a feature it can fully explain in your view. Is that what you're arguing?
I'm saying that a Scorch can produce, or a Scorch can be made with a soldering iron that doesn't look too bad. This is going to sound weird, but I've got it up here.
Okay.
Now let's see if I can find you and I can share the screen.
Yeah.
This is always very complicated going through this palaver.
No.
So this, as I say, this was done by a chap called Hugh Duncan, who was a school teacher with a soldering iron. Now I've got present, share screen.
And while you're bringing that up, just to clarify for the audience, because you both Bob and Hugh have referenced Colin Berry, and you might be confused. Well, aren't we talking about his method, the Toastograph hypothesis, next? Well, with Colin Berry, he's gone through at least 10 different models. So at one time, he did espouse the traditional Scorch hypothesis with a statue instead of a bas-relief. So he's actually relevant to the general discussion as well as to the next one we'll be talking about. So, yep, we can see the screen there, Hugh.
So, it's gone a bit small. Let's whack it up a bit. So, this, as I say, was it's one. I'm just looking at the side. It's 1/5 real size, but apart from the blood marks, which I think were put on as paint, the image that you see there was done entirely with a soldering iron. Can we see that?
Yep.
And he also did the back image, which is there.
So there's the hot spots, and it looks like it's not complete. So the contact or not contact. But where's the 3D?
That's right. So if we move it across to his version, right. So if we look there on the right-hand side, that is his version of the shroud, painted with a soldering iron. And I think you'll agree that it's really remarkably good. The negative effect is extremely efficient. I don't think you'd have to blow it up much bigger not to think that it might in fact be the same thing. But if we look at it here, you can see certain inconsistencies. But the negative effect is certainly present, in my opinion. Now, I also, further on in the article, I think I tried to put it into 3D, and that's how I got it.
That looks horrible. Like
you can see this doesn't. You can see this big lump here. That's obviously the blood stain in the chest, which is pretty hideous. But if we look at the legs and so on, and indeed and the face here, I don't think that looks too bad at all.
Yes, all that indicates is that he was copying from one to the other.
Yes.
He was copying from one to the other, and if you copied it exactly, yes, it would display three-dimensionality. If you copy it exactly,
yeah.
So there's no problem in that, But there's so many problems with what he's done. It would fluoresce under ultraviolet light.
Yes, it would. Yes,
where's the shroud? It's not. So every effort to come up with a means to create the Shroud of Turin, they're all so bad that all it does is prove that's how the image on the shroud were not created. Every attempt has been negative. Every attempt has been only proven how it was not done.
Okay, so one thing you guys keep mentioning the ultraviolet fluorescence. So I actually have a clip, a short little 2-minute clip from Barry Schwartz talking about this because it's something you both agree on. So I want to play that clip, and then I want to raise a potential objection that someone like Colin Berry might raise against this and see how you guys respond. So let me share my screen just to share that quick little clip. And sound, okay. And bring that up. Okay, are you guys seeing that on YouTube? Okay, yeah. So it's just a couple. Okay.
Next, the shroud.
And you guys hearing it?
Yeah.
That image is a scorch from a heated statue. Well, we've already challenged that in that last part of the presentation, but let's talk about it. Stirp determined that if cloth had been heated enough to scorch it, there would be changes in the structure of the flax fibers and the blood, and there was none. Kinetic studies support a low temperature image formation process. Remember, there are many documented scorches on the shroud to compare to, and Stirp studied them in great detail. So the places on the shroud where the scorches crossed over water stains, image, or blood gave the chemists and the physicists ample opportunity to analyze that and determine that paints and pigments couldn't have been the case, nor could a scorch be the solution. And Joe Nickel proposed that theory. However, he is a former stage magician and not affiliated with any scientific or academic institution. He's not a scientist. Nickel did not provide one example of a scorched image on linen. A scorch would not have the same chemical and physical characteristics as a Shroud image, and Nickel's results were never published in any peer-reviewed scientific journals, just a TV show. So, you know, we're not doing science on TV shows yet. So, scorched linen will fluoresce under certain types of UV illumination. Stirp found that the scorches on the Shroud fluoresced as expected, but the image itself did not. In fact, it actually inhibited the yellow-green background fluorescence of the cloth, completely eliminating heat as a possible image formation mechanism. And you can see slight red fluorescence in the areas surrounding the scorches and one of these 1978 Vern Miller UV fluorescence photographs. It's a little hard to see here, but there is a reddish kind of halo around the scorched areas, and there were plenty of them on the Shroud to use as control samples. So, but look at the hands. The hands don't show any of that, and if anything, they block the yellow-green background fluorescence. So, I just said that, okay. So here's the UV fluorescence paper.
Okay, so that's the clip from Barry there, and I just want to put it to you guys because you both agree this is an objection to a traditional scorch method. Now, obviously, the key there is so someone like Delfino, he did his scorch as a high temperature scorch, something like 200 degrees Celsius. But others like Colin Berry, they'll come in and say, yeah, but if you have a lower temperature degree scorch, then it doesn't fluoresce. So this isn't an objection against the scorch hypothesis. How do you guys kind of come back if somebody says that it just depends on the temperature of the scorch as to whether we would expect it to fluoresce under UV light or not? Bob, over to you.
Well, that's something that can be determined experimentally. Normally, you think of a scorch as like an iron left too long on a bed sheet. That's a scorch, and it scorches the top surface, and it scorches through to the bottom surface. And it might have a little bit of smooth gradation around the image of the iron, but that's the typical scorch hypothesis. Using a hot object of some sort. If it was so easy, there's $1 million offer out there for someone to do it. And I think it's worthwhile. Why not spend 10 years of your life trying to win $1 million?
Exactly. Yeah, it's out there. Hugh,
I think myself, there's different ways to discolor fibers. Now, I'm using my experience in Italy was that the Italians have a different understanding of the word discolor, and I just mean discolor in the sense of changing the color. In other words, linen cloth already has a color. It's off-white. And so what we're doing is we're changing the color. Whereas in Europe, I find that the word means to lighten the color. So there's a translation problem. But all I mean is that it's changing the color from an off-white to the right color on the Shroud would be a straw yellow or sepia color.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about a scorch, the positive element about a scorch, is that it produces that color, as I understand it. So that some people find a scorch attractive because it produces the right color of discoloration. But there are so many drawbacks from a hot scorch that it's just not feasible, cannot be done. And so therefore, the other option here is a cold scorch. That is a scorch that has no rise in temperature at all in general. And that's what my concept of image formation is. That the discoloration is not due to a chemical change. It's due to electrical heating, alternating current. It's called to produce the extremely thin discoloration all around the fibers. How in the world do you do that? And I did think of one mechanism to do that, and this is based on my first year of physics at University of Michigan. It's called the skin effect of an alternating current, where the alternating current, the electrons going back and forth in the wire, produces enlarging and collapsing electrical and magnetic fields, which force the neutrons to the very outside radius of the conductor, exactly where the discoloration is located. So that in my concept, it was due to a high temperature, but only over this extremely thin region of less than 0.2 micrometers, fully around the circumference, entirely around the circumference of the fiber. And that's the only mechanism that I know of that could produce that effect. Therefore, any hypothesis that you come up with has to determine how an alternating current could be produced in the fibers.
Now, just before I turn it over to Hugh, you mentioned something that I was going to ask about next. So I just want to follow up, because you said that a plus about the Scorch hypothesis is that it produces the same color. No, when I did my thing, I was in my research, someone like Thibaut Heimberger back in 2014, he argued the opposite, because the Scorch kind of makes it too dark, like it's a brown, or it's not the proper straw yellow color. So what's your take on that? Does it actually produce the straw yellow color of the Shroud's body images, or does it come out too dark, or
yes, normally under human control it would come out too dark. That's why you need a computer to control it. And it has to be extremely light touch or effect of the Scorch to produce this straw yellow coloration.
Gotcha, I understand. Perfect. Okay, Hugh. Oops, is perfect. Right when I go to Hugh, he's looks like he's having trouble with his internet. You're still hearing me, right, Bob?
Yes, I can. Well, okay. Maybe until he comes back, maybe I could fill in a little bit here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That people who want to prove that the Shroud of Turin is just a fake underestimate the difficulty of producing the front and dorsal images with the characteristics that scientific experiments have proven to exist on the images. And any hypothesis is not going to be adequate unless it's consistent with all the evidence. Now, in my case, I use 27 different evidences. So any Shroud image hypothesis has to be consistent, in my mind, with at least those 27 scientific evidences, and maybe more if you go into detail of the papers that Giulio Fonti has done in the past.
All right, Hugh. So yeah, sorry, you got cut off there, but
yes, my internet went down and then it came back up again. So yeah.
So what's your take on the issue of the coloration itself, but also about the ultraviolet fluorescence, and somebody coming back and saying, well, that only applies to certain high temperature scorches?
Well, as I said, I attempted to scorch things at such a low temperature that it didn't actually produce any discoloration at all. But I still got the ultraviolet, a very bright ultraviolet rim around there. Now, I wanted to, I missed a bit, but I wanted to go back to this idea that for some reason that a piece of cellulose can be altered physically but not chemically. And I get a bit confused here. I think we should try and clarify that a piece of cellulose, two bits of cellulose which are two different colors, which are distinguishable by eye, are different chemically. you can't just say that I've made a physical change to the cellulose and that will make it either a different color or a different shade or anything like that. The physical the physical mechanisms, whatever they happen to be, such as radiation, are producing a chemical change. And Al Adler especially was very clear that what we were looking at was the creation of carbonyl bonds and something else, and specifically that radiation would only cause this particular kind of chemical change rather than that particular kind of chemical change. Now, he probably wasn't thinking of perhaps a neutron or proton attack rather than basically a scorch. But the essence is that if you can see something different on the shroud, it's been chemically changed. And the question is not whether it's chemically changed or not. It definitely has been chemically changed. The question is, how has that chemical change come about? And this is where it was interesting. I mean, you were saying that Bob spent some time in Italy. I spent literally days transcribing, or almost completely transcribing, the 1981 STIRP conference tapes, which Barry put up on shroud.com recently. And it was interesting there how in 1981, at least, everyone was dead against radiation. They said radiation was not possible to produce. This was not possible for radiation to have produced the image on the shroud. And this was essentially because Al Adler said that it had not produced the same chemical changes to the structure of the cellulose, which he thought he'd observed. So from that point of view, the two salient points in 1981, and I appreciate that things have moved on and they've changed, and even the shroud, the surviving STIRP scientists would probably have said, well, we've changed our minds since then, and radiation has come back as a much more which has been able to be accepted, but at the time they were dead against it. I'll try and find the chemical bonds that they were particularly against. So yes, they were either going for the some sort of painting or contact hypothesis, or the Vignon vaporograph hypothesis, which is basically the Maillard hypothesis that Ray Rogers was going for, and indeed which Colin Berry goes for, saying that this the temperature-free chemical deterioration of the shroud is because of the application of chemicals, not because of the application of any kind of radiation.
Okay, so I'll let Bob respond if he wants, but just to clarify, this is more of an attack on the radiation hypothesis, or does this relate to the Scorch hypothesis as well, Hugh?
Well, essentially, I think it's probably a mistake to separate the two. Okay. We're talking here of electromagnetic radiation, essentially, okay, coming from somewhere and damaging the chemical makeup of some cellulose. Now, that electromagnetic radiation may, for all I know, be radio waves, although I don't know whether that can do that. It can be visible light waves, which is what happens when you leave a newspaper out in the sun. It could be ultraviolet rays, which is what Paolo Di Lazzaro plays with, because that's his speciality. Or it could be infrared, or for all I know, microwaves. Infrared is of course, Christophe Donné's speciality. I don't know that anyone's tried to microwave an image of the shroud, but I suspect that would be possible to discolor cellulose in that way as well.
Okay. So I'll let Bob get the last word on this, and then I want to switch gears to focusing on Colin Berry's most up-to-date, as I call it, the Toastograph. But yeah, Bob, if you want to give a quick response to Hugh's issue on the radiation there.
I would like to, but I'm not sure if I can do it quickly. There's so much here. The old idea, Hugh is right. The old idea of radiation causing the image does not work. And that is because the old idea is that radiation damage to the cloth was causing these molecular changes in the cloth. And that I don't think that's correct, because the radiation would be coming from a direction, and so that as that radiation then goes through the fiber, it would discolor the fiber as it traveled through the fiber. So it would not produce discoloration extremely thinly all the way around the fiber, so that radiation damage is not what is causing the image. Now, Hugh brought up that we're talking about electromagnetic radiation. No, we're not. I'm not. I'm talking about particle.
This is what Stirp was talking about in 1981. No, I appreciate your radiation.
And that doesn't work for the reason I just mentioned. But so I'm talking about particle radiation. The charged particles are capable of producing an alternating current in the fibers, which then produce this extremely thin discoloration by the skin effect of an alternating current. You can look that up on Wikipedia. So it works. Radiation does work if you're using particles, but not electromagnetic radiation. By the way, in this concept of particles can also thrust the dried blood off the body onto the cloth, thus explaining why the blood that would have dried on the cloth, on the body, is now on the cloth. And I don't think there's any other really suitable explanation for that as well. Now, when I say that the discoloration, when I say that the discoloration was not caused by a chemical reaction, normally in chemistry class, you bring one chemical into contact with another chemical, and then you get a chemical reaction where the new materials that you bring in to the old materials are thus interacting with them and maybe adding atoms to them or rearranging atoms or rearranging the atoms that we see.
You're popular today.
I'm sorry, I'm being interrupted here.
No worries. But yeah.
Okay, we took care of that. So that when I say that it was not due to a chemical reaction, I recognize that when you see the images on the Shroud of Turin, it's because the atoms that were already in the cellulose have been rearranged in their atomic structure. And that can be done by my mechanism in my paper 34. So we're in talking about that. We're not talking about adding a chemical to produce a chemical change, but we're talking about radiation, thus rearranging the atoms that are already there. That would be the distinction.
All right, awesome. Yeah, so thank you so much. And yeah, just so you guys know, if Bob, I'm assuming you'll be up for this, and Hugh as well. But for my next panel review, I'm thinking of let's bring on a panel to talk about the radiation hypotheses proper. So we'll have the entire show dedicated to going over all the theories there. So and just one comment from the audience from Teddy, who mentions on this from Heller's book, the conjugated carbonyl is the end product of dehydrating acid oxidation. By contrast, alkaline oxidation produces no color, and conjugated carbonyls are straw yellow. So yeah, that's she wanted to contribute to what you guys are saying there. All right, cool. So go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, could I just give an example here?
Sure.
There's different ways to say this. You know, one is a dehydration, oxidation dehydration process. And thank you for putting that on. There's just various ways of saying it. This dehydration oxidation process results in the atomic structure being rearranged of the atoms that were already in the cellulose. So we're really saying the same thing. But I prefer to talk in terms of the single electron bonds of the carbon atoms, some of them being altered into double electron bonds, because that's the result of the dehydration oxidation process. And just the example that I use to help people physically understand what this means. For example, if you take a softball and you connect 4 springs on it, north, south, east, and west, 4 sides of the softball, and then you connect it into a very stiff box made out of steel, for example, or concrete, whatever. But you have a spring at the north, south, east, and west corners of the softball. You then hit it with a softball bat, it's going to vibrate in a certain way. Now, if you take the east spring off the, let's say, steel box and connect it onto the north side, so that you have 2 springs on the north side, one on the west, one on the south, you then hit it with a softball bat, it's going to vibrate in a different manner. Now, that's what's causing the difference in the color, so that when an ultraviolet ray comes in, it hits the carbon atom, causes it to vibrate, and how it vibrates depends on how it's connected to the surrounding atoms. So that's physically what's going on when we see a discoloration on the shroud.
All right, awesome. Yeah,
I should say that at the same time, we're also losing a certain amount of water, aren't we?
Yes.
In order to produce those that change of bonds.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah. Can I I want to quote just to tidy up the ionizing radiation business. In other words, the electromagnetic radiation, which I appreciate is not the same as Bob's subatomic radiation. But this is Al Adler. The only chemical tests that proved positive on the image areas were for aldehydes and for carboxylic acid groups, which can only be achieved by dehydrative oxidation. Now, it turns out that there's 2 ways you can oxidize cellulose. If you oxidize this under alkaline conditions with ionizing radiation, it will give you carboxyl groups only, where it oxidizes, no aldehydes. And in fact, if you oxidize linen this way, it stays white. On the other hand, if you oxidize it under acidic conditions or pyrolytic conditions, that's like scorch conditions, then you dehydrate before you oxidize and you get aldehyde groups forming. The chromophore is in fact a conjugated carbonyl group. The ultraviolet absorption peaks for conjugated carbonyls, of course, depends on the degree of conjugation, but the peaks are characteristically found between 315 and 350 nanometers, which were peaks that they said they saw in spectra. So that's why Adler is definitely not keen on ionizing radiation, but he is keen at this particular moment on saying that a scorch would produce the discoloration. And that's all he says. He doesn't mention the ultraviolet fluorescence or anything like that at this point, but that a scorch would produce both the conjugated carbonyl groups and the aldehyde groups.
All right.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. That's fine. I think it's useful to do experiments to just prove to yourself that a chemical reaction by adding different chemicals to linen cloth cannot produce what we see on the Shroud of Turin. That's not how it was done.
All right, awesome. So at this point, I'm gonna jump in. I want to switch gears to the artistic mechanism that I think Dr. Colin Berry's, what he calls his film set model 10, which is a heat-based model, but it's got slight differences and that sort of thing. And just so the audience knows, I reached out multiple times to Colin Berry. I invited him on to defend his model, but he didn't want to come on or respond to that. So I started with Bob first last time. So Hugh, I'll start with you first this time. Do you want to give kind of your introduction? First of all, what is, because his blogs are kind of confusing. What exactly is Colin Berry's most recent hypothesis, and what's your evaluation of that mechanism?
In essence, I think what we're looking at is a kind of reaction that produces browning in foods, such as toast and to a certain extent steak and things like that, which is called the Maillard reaction after the French scientist who first described it. And it requires the interaction of 2 different kinds of chemical, one of which Colin is suggesting is a starch, as far as I can see, and indeed so did Ray Rogers. And the other, I'm not sure. Perhaps he's considering something which is mixed in with the starch. I know he mixed his starch with oil to make it stick, or it may have been that he was just heating up the starch and decomposing it. Now, at one point, certainly, I'm trying to contrast his Maillard reaction with Ray Rogers's reaction. Ray was of the opinion that every fiber of every thread of the cloth was covered with a thin layer of starch left over from the production process, and that thin layer had reacted with amines, proteins decomposing gases from a decomposing body. Now, I'm not sure where Colin gets his decomposition of the starch from, but either way, both of them end up with starch which has been affected. Now, as far as I can see, Colin thinks that the starch is somehow glued into the shroud, like some kind of wattle and daub, which seemed to me very unlikely. And some of his experiments have involved getting fibers which are absolutely glued together by his starch, which just doesn't compare with what, say, pictures of starch threads and Mark Evans's micrographs of the shroud look like. Either way, the discoloration, according to both Colin and Ray Rogers, is not on the shroud fibers at all. It's on the layer of starch which covered them. I think that's his point, and I think I disagree with that.
Fair. All right, fair enough. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And Bob, over to you. What's kind of your give your introduction? First of all, if you want to summarize, what is Colin's most recent method, and what's your evaluation or critique of that hypothesis?
Well, I think he said he had made 371 posts on the website that you sent to me, and it's so long, and I couldn't find any good description of what he was talking about. It's very confusing. He doesn't really get to the issue. There's no summary of what he's saying. He's just criticizing various people for various responses, and so it's very, very difficult. Nevertheless, I just, based on kind of what I assume he's saying here, that I assume he's saying that he assumed that the shroud was proven to be some type of forgery or fake because of the 1988 carbon dating of the shroud to 1260 to 1390. But multiple analyses have proven that this date for the shroud should be given no credibility. And that's dealt with in many different papers, but including my paper number 33. Thus, according to this assumption, I called it the RFO, the roasted flour oil process. The RFO process probably took place between 1260 and 1390, but this ignores the many evidences that the shroud is much older than 1260 to 1390, many convincing evidences, I think. If the shroud was made in 1260 to 1390, then the nail wounds would have been in the middle of the palms instead of the wrists, and the thumbs would have been prominently shown, consistent with paintings in the Middle Ages, which they're not. Okay, so I think he has the wrong year, first of all, for the making of the shroud. So anyway, in going through my 27 different evidences that I considered, I came up with 19 different comments in relation to Colin Berry's concept here. I think if Colin Berry can come up with a roasted superhero hypothesis, The figurine looked like a little plastic superhero to me.
Yes,
It
yes, I think it was.
Looks like an Iron Man or something. Yeah.
Yeah, Iron Man. That's right. So I think I'll come up with a hypothesis. I'm going to take my pan, put it on the fire, put in a piece of linen cloth, and then break a fried egg onto it. And I bet I'll come up with discoloration. That'll be the fried egg hypothesis. Most of these are so laughable that I don't want to give them any time. But I have to, because somehow people are so gullible that they believe this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think Colin Berry is mentioned anywhere at all except on his own website and possibly mine and Dale's. So I don't know that a lot of people even understand it. So they're not in a position, let alone believe it.
Yes.
So I don't think there's much danger of that. I have discovered that, yes, he seemed to think, yes, that the amino carbonyl reactions, they all take place in the starch, which basically is flour. So he doesn't need any decomposing amines such as ammonia, which is what Ray Rogers suggested. His essence seems to be that his flour is literally, he mentions the word glue several times, that the flour is actually embedded in the threads of the shroud, which just seems to me not justified by either the sticky tape slides or the micrographs that we've got, or any analysis of any part of the shroud that's ever been carried out. So I think that's a big mistake. The other thing that I think is perhaps worth mentioning is that both his and, as far as I can recall, Ray Rogers's Maillard reactions didn't result in anything visible except after either a considerable period of time or a considerable period of heat. And so that would mean that if you assume it's a first century creation in a tomb from a dead body, whether it's by radiation or by a Maillard hypothesis, it's not impossible that the image was not visible until hundreds of years later. Whereas if you go for a medieval hypothesis, then it's not credible that a person should want to make an invisible image. I don't think. And so if Colin's hypothesis is that the image was made invisibly by a medieval forger, then I think that's odd. I suspect he would say that the forger knew that he was going to make a latent image and then bung it in an oven and heat it up and thus produce the actual image. But that, again, it gets more and more convoluted as far as I'm concerned. I've got to skip back to one thing that Bob was saying about the very precise conditions under which the shroud was made and how difficult it will be to produce in exactly similar conditions. And that seems to me to that there's a sort of a procedural dichotomy going on here. To me, in many ways, that if it was produced by medieval processes, probably followed, I may say, by washing nearly all the processes off, then the result that we've got is not necessarily something that was specifically designed by the person who produced the image. He was probably producing something rather different. And the analogy seems to me a bit like coming across a car crash and digging a car out of the bottom of a ravine and saying, reproduce this exactly. And the answer is it's very unlikely to reproduce it absolutely exactly. We may produce other car crashes which are sufficiently similar to be generically, we're able to say that they're generically likely to be much the same. without actually ever being able to produce something which is absolutely and precisely the same. So I may, even if I was doing a Scorch hypothesis, which I was to say I'm not because of the ultraviolet problem, but supposing the ultraviolet problem didn't exist, I might heat my Bas-Relief up to such and such a temperature and put the cloth on and take it off, and I get a cloth which is a little bit like the Shroud, but not sufficiently exactly. So I do it and I heat it up for a bit longer, or I leave the cloth on for a bit more, or something like that. And without doing an infinite range of experiments to get exactly the same conditions, I don't think it's probable that I would ever get an exact reproduction of what we find on the Shroud. The exact nature of the bas-relief, would it have to be, an inch thick? Would the grooves in it, would the elevation have to be a centimeter or an inch or 2 inches or whatever it was? So I think proof of concept is what I would be going for, rather than an exact reproduction.
Yes, but a proof of concept, if it contradicts any of the 27 scientific evidences of the Shroud of Turin, if it contradicts any of those, it simply proves that the images on the Shroud were not done in that way.
Not
it doesn't have to be exactly, to the eye. It doesn't have to be exactly, but it has to be consistent with all the scientific evidences that we have.
I'd agree with that. Yeah.
If it violates one, then that tells us that's not how it was done.
Yes. Well, that's fair enough. I'll go for that. It must have that 3D characteristic must be there. It can't look like a block print, for example, or something like that. Yeah.
And just to summarize the process, before you guys get into the discussion of this evaluation, so basically he's positing the cloth has some kind of oil or glue or starch or something like that, and then he covers his face or whatever it is, the model, the bas-relief in flour, and then he imprints this onto the cloth, and then he heats this in an oven, creating this Maillard reaction, which is what the color is. And I think he says that his temperature is a low temperature, so he has 180 degrees Celsius. So that's where he's trying to say he avoids the UV fluorescence problem and stuff, but we've already discussed that. So would you say that's kind of an accurate description of his method, just for the audience in a nutshell?
Yes.
I think so.
Could I say something about the Maillard reaction?
Yeah, absolutely.
A typical example of the Maillard reaction is when you take bread and you put it into a toaster. You heat it for a certain amount of time. It pops up and it's discolored. Now, I'm 74 years old. I've made toast just about every day of my life. And I have never had a piece of toast pop up in the toaster with an image of the Shroud of Turin on it. And the reason for that is that the toaster is not controlling where the molecules of the bread are discolored, because there is no information being fed into it. To form such an image, you require information. Now, when a person tries to duplicate the Shroud, it's the person who's trying to copy the image on the Shroud and thus providing the information himself. If you don't have a person involved in some way, you have to have information automatically being communicated to the cloth to control which fibers on the Shroud are to be discolored and the length of that discoloration. There has to be a tremendous amount of information transferred, and that information has to come from the body, so that the information has to go from the body across the air gap between the two, if there is an air gap, and then be deposited on the cloth to control which fibers are discolored and the length of that discoloration. So that's what I'm saying, that it's an immense challenge to create the images by just a natural process or by some kind of process that we imagine in the past. I can do just as well with my fried egg hypothesis as most people do with what they come up with.
Awesome. All right, cool. So yeah, I'll let you guys kind of go back and forth on evaluating this, where it fit, what features can it explain, what features can't Colin Berry's method explain.
Well, this is, if I could just have a look, you're not going to believe this. This is a Maillard reaction. And I was stimulated to present it by Bob mentioning that he'd never seen the Shroud of Turin pop up on his toast.
Oh no, Tara is coming back. So yeah, you walked into it, Bob. There are Jesus toasts out there.
Now, this is how to produce Jesus's face with a Maillard reaction on a toaster. Now, it's obviously a heat reaction. Now, to me, it looks like it's going to produce almost entirely a contact reaction. So I rather doubt that we're going to get a good three-dimensional image of that.
Sure, everything I said is still true. Information is being provided to that process by the design of the cooking equipment.
Yes.
So there's no conflict here with anything that I said.
No, but
it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
If you feel that your life has been wasted because you haven't seen Jesus on a piece of toast for $50, you can have that experience.
I don't want it. I don't want that experience.
And now you know why I call Colin Berry's the Toastograph. I thought you should have stuck with
more
that.
Interesting, I suspect. Perhaps more sensible, more interesting. If we cut the piece of toast in half, or in fact, if we didn't use toast, if we used a piece of linen, I wonder if we could get a similar discoloration, which didn't go all the way through the linen, for example. If we did do that, then it wouldn't be a Maillard reaction because we'd be just using pure cellulose. It's almost worth investing in one to experiment with. But I expect that it would still glow violently, ultravioletly, which would put me off.
Okay.
Well, could I go through my remaining 18 objections to Colin Berry's concept here? Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing, so Mr. Jetty is saying there's insufficient information. I don't know if that's a question or he's just affirming. But yeah, Mr. Jetty, if you've got a question, just put it in the chat and I'll raise it after Bob does this thing.
Yes. Okay. So number one was just the timing of this that supposedly being made in 1260 to 1390. Number two, and I call this the RFO process. That's the roasted flour oil process. Probably would have left material on the cloth. Evidently, he's assuming some kind of a glue that's coating the fibers that would have been detected by the stirrup experiments. Of course it would have. It probably would have produced clumping of fibers or threads and possibly stiffening of the cloth, none of which are present. Number three, the stirrup experiments found no evidence of capillarity, which is soaking up of a liquid. Yet the RFO process would have involved capillarity in the fibers and threads due to soaking up of the oil. Number four, the RFO hypothesis does not explain the scourge marks or blood stains on the shroud. Number five, the shroud includes a front and dorsal image of a crucified man. The quality of both images was about the same, indicating that both images were probably formed by the same process. However, testing related to the RFO hypothesis only produced an image of the bottom side of the figurine that was laying on the cloth. To get a front image, you had to turn the front down in the roasting process. We are not shown evidence of an image that was produced on cloth that was above the body of the figurine. He's only producing one image, not two. Number six, the resolution of the front and dorsal images on the shroud is far better than the resolution of the superhero figurine produced on the cloth. This would have been far more apparent if testing of the RFO hypothesis used a model like the crucified man imaged on the shroud than a toy figurine of a superhero. Number 7, the plastic figurine used for testing of the RFO hypothesis produced a blurry, erratic image of itself on the side of the cloth that was in contact with the bottom of the figurine. We are not told or shown whether there is also an image on the other side of the cloth. If there is an easily discernible image on the other side of the cloth, this would contradict the Shroud of Turin. We are also not shown an image on a cloth that would have been placed above the figurine during the roasting process. I already mentioned that once. Number 8, the images on the shroud are caused by fiber discoloration in only the top 2 or 3 layers of fibers in a thread, with those discolored fibers facing toward the body on both the front as well as the dorsal image. There is no claim that this is true for the RFO hypothesis, and it is doubtful that this would be true. That's related to the superficiality of the images on the shroud. And number 9, the threads in the images on the shroud are discolored in a mottled pattern, yet this mottled pattern forms the front and dorsal images of a crucified man. The threads in the images are I have a duplication there. I don't need to read it again. But there's no claim in the RFO hypothesis that this is true for his model. Number 10, the discoloration. The discoloration on all the discolored fibers on the shroud is approximately the same color, usually called a straw yellow or light sepia color. The image of the superhero figurine on the cloth is the wrong color. You know, there's so little to recommend it. It's just amazing. It might be called a gray to black color. Number 11, the discoloration on the image fibers on the shroud has a thickness of less than 0.2 micrometers, with the discoloration around the outer circumference of the fiber, with the inside of the flax fiber not discolored. There's no claim that this is true for the RFO hypothesis, and it provides no mechanism that this RFO process would cause this to be true. Number 12, there are images of bones on the shroud. I think that's rather obvious. The RFO hypothesis provides no mechanism that this would cause this to be true. Number 13, the images on the shroud contain 3D or topographical information related to the vertical distance of from the body to the cloth at each point of the image. There is no claim that this is true for the RFO hypothesis, and it provides no mechanism that would cause this to be true. Number 14, on the shroud, the discoloration on the image fibers is due to some of the single electron bonds of the carbon atoms that were previously in the cellulose being changed to double electron bonds. This means that there were no materials added to the cloth to form the images. The atomic structure of the atoms in the cellulose were merely rearranged. This is contrary to the RFO hypothesis, which claims that a chemical reaction of flour and oil on the cloth in the roasting process caused the discoloration. Number 15, on the shroud, the top threads facing the body create a non-discolored region on otherwise discolored threads that are beneath them, like a shadow of the top thread on the under thread. There is no claim that this is true for the RFO hypothesis, and it is very unlikely to be true due to capillarity of the oil on the cloth. Number 16, the RFO hypothesis does not explain the bright spots on the mustache of the shroud. I think those need to be explained. Number 17, the images on the shroud were not affected by heat in the 1532 fire or subsequent water thrown onto the shroud after the fire. The RFO hypothesis does not explain this. The images of number 18, images of various parts of flowers were encoded onto the side of the shroud facing the body. The RFO hypothesis does not explain this. Number 19, during the Stirp experiments on the shroud in 1978, many oxidizing and reducing agents were applied image fibers to determine which agents would eliminate the fiber discoloration. None of them eliminated the discoloration except for diamite, which eliminated the discoloration immediately when it was applied. The RFO hypothesis does not explain this. Those are my comments regarding Colin Berry's
Awesome.
roasted flour oil hypothesis.
Exactly. Wow, that was awesome. Yeah, very thorough. So yeah, at this point, I want to go to the discussion period. I know Hugh's been writing notes. I've been writing lots of notes. So yeah, Hugh, over to you. Do you want to discuss some of Hugh's points? Which ones do you agree with? Which ones do you?
Yes. Well, the thing is, Bob will know that. I mean, I don't think that we can see bones on the shroud. I don't think that the blood is diagnostic of a first century cloth. I don't think there's anything wrong with the radiocarbon date, and I don't see flowers. I think things which are not directly related to the production of the image shouldn't necessarily be brought in as being a good reason objectively why this or that process wasn't the cause of the shroud. Obviously, if you start premise number one, the shroud is first century, then a whole lot of things follow from that, which don't necessarily follow if you don't start with that premise.
Yeah, I don't start with that premise.
No. Well, so I'm going to ignore the blood, the flowers, the radiocarbon date, which I find nothing wrong with. But I will have a look at one or two things. Firstly, the resolution, which we hear is very poor. I think the resolution, for what it is much better than that of the shroud, and I will show you why by doing this. Right, this little man, share.
Yep. Okay, it's popping up
It's
now.
14 centimeters high. All right, and we can see, for example, he has those. His thumbs are clearly distinguished from his fingers. We can see the groove between his powerful deltoid muscles. We can see the two dimples, which are his eyes. Now, the shroud has nothing like that kind of resolution at that level. The nearest we could possibly get to is the lower lip, which is perhaps has a resolution of about 0.5 centimeter. Apart from that, if the shroud resolution is probably at something in the region of 2 or 3 centimeters of discrimination, which would make this a meaningless blur. You certainly wouldn't be able to distinguish the fingers and thumbs. So I think the shroud the resolution of this is reasonably good. And then just below it, this is the 3D image. Now this would be slightly more convincing if it was at a better angle, and also if we didn't actually see the colors of the photograph on it, but if it was just in grayscale or something like that. But as you can see, even so, we can see the bulge of the deltoids. We can see dimples in the eyes. We can certainly see bulges in the knees. So from that point of view, I think it has to be said that Colin has achieved the negative and the 3D version. I think there's lots of things he hasn't achieved, but saying that his resolution is poor is, I think, a mistake.
I think it's very poor. For example, if you look at that image, the head is not connected to the body. You have gaps. You have two or three gaps. The hands are not connected to the arms. You have gaps. The feet are not connected to the legs. You have gaps throughout this image. So why not just laugh about it and move on?
We certainly laugh about it. Yes. But apart from, I mean, I know the head is not connected to the body, but the fact is that the shroud, the head is not connected to the body either. I mean, it depends what we mean by resolution. To my mind, the resolution is that if there are two features which are closer than a centimeter apart, but you can distinguish between them, then that image has a resolution of better than a centimeter. Whereas if two things are a centimeter apart and you can't distinguish between them, then the resolution is worse than that of a centimeter. And since you cannot see on the shroud things like nipples, navels, shoulder, collarbones, fingernails, there's all sorts of things that make the resolution of the shroud extremely poor. Whereas in this case, as we can see, the certain amount of fine detail which can be distinguished, which you certainly can't distinguish on the shroud.
Yeah, yeah.
You're using the resolution in a different way.
Yeah, you're basing that judgment on the concept that the image was formed by reflected light. So when we look at a person in reflected light, you can see the nipples, you can see the fingernails, you can see all these different things. But the image on the shroud was not formed by reflected light. The image mechanism was totally different. The resolution is usually quoted to be about 4 or 5 millimeters on the shroud.
But that only in one place, only in the lower lip. Certainly not 4 to 5 millimeters in the eyes. It's nothing like that.
We don't see the eyes because there's evidently circular objects over the eyes.
Yeah, but you can't resolve them to any particular size to within a couple of centimeters either way. They're mere blobs.
Yeah,
the resolution of them is very poor.
There are inherent limits to the resolution of the image on the shroud because of the way in which it was formed. It's formed by discoloration of the fibers on the top 2 or 3 fibers in a thread with modeling of that discoloration across various threads. So that process of modeling, for example, would limit the resolution to the range of 4 or 5 millimeters.
Well, it wouldn't necessarily have to do that. I mean, you can print things onto cloth with a much better resolution. I mean, in fact, the pattern on the shirt is considerably better resolution than 4 or 5 millimeters. I mean, take a Hawaiian shirt that's printed onto cloth, and its resolution is extremely good. Its resolution is probably something like 0.5 millimeter.
Yeah, but that mechanism did not produce the images on the shroud.
Oh no, I see what you mean. Yes, that's correct. But it's not a feature of it's not because of the nature of the cloth that resolution is not possible. But if it's the nature of
it's primarily related. It's primarily related to the nature of the image formation mechanism.
Yeah, I'll go for that.
Sorry, I was muted. Sorry. So I think what I'm hearing here, so going through each of the minimal relevant features and the attributes. So on negativity, I think we both agree Colin Berry's method can achieve a negative image. I think we disagree about whether it explains the shroud's high resolution. I'm correct in summarizing that. Hugh agrees that Hugh says that Colin's method can produce the 3D images, and he provided the image from Berry's website. Did you have anything you wanted to say about that, Bob, or on the three-dimensionality? How does Berry's method do on that front?
What Hugh showed there was not a true test of the presence of three-dimensional information. For example, in the early 70s, John Jackson placed a photograph of the face under an electronic device. I'm trying to think of the name of it.
VP8.
The VP8 image analyzer, which then brought up what was very apparently a three-dimensional the presence of three-dimensional information. So in order to test that, you would have to put the cloth that Colin Berry produced under a VP8 image analyzer, and that has not been done yet.
Well, no, you'd have to put it into any kind of image manipulation software.
Or software, yes.
I'm not sure what he was using, but that picture which I showed you just now was, I think, under something called ImageJ, which is 3D imaging software.
Well, the face on that figurine was so small that it's difficult to make a judgment. If he really believed that this is the case, let's see something with a little bit more detail so that we can use image analyzing software to detect three-dimensional presence of three-dimensional information and do it properly. That's so small. I don't know if you can tell whether there is or isn't 3D information there.
One thing I'll add on his blog site, Colin Berry, interestingly, he has done his own face. So it's a bigger thing, but he doesn't provide the 3D of his face. So I'm just wondering.
Do you want me to have a go at that while I'll see if I can find it.
Did he roast his face?
He put flour on his face and then he imprinted it on the cloth and then he roasted the cloth. So I can show it if you want. I've got it up on my screen. But and he was saying how bring it up. So here's the image that he got of his own face. Interesting. He doesn't have facial hair, so he laughs about that because it looks like he's got a beard and mustache. But
see, now a person who is certain that the Shroud of Turin is a forge or a fakery would take a look at that and say, see, the image on the Shroud of Turin can be produced by a little modification in this process. And I look at that and I say, that just proves it wasn't done that way.
Yeah. All right, cool. So it is okay. So there's a dispute on the three-dimensionality aspect. Now, one thing, hold on, even here, there's, in terms of body image uniformity, the intensity of color, even here it looks different. But as Teddy was mentioning, when we're talking about full-length images, you're going to have this issue of hotspots. And I think even Hugh mentioned that in his intro. But yeah, how do you guys, in terms of body image uniformity, would this share the same problems as the traditional Scorch method? Do you guys think Colin's method would do better? What is your guys' takes on that?
Say that again. Is that one thing that concerning uniformity? I think it should work, provided you covered your bas-relief with a uniform amount of flour and you heated the subsequent thing uniformly. That should be okay.
Okay, so you don't think there would be the issue of Teddy's raising the issue of hotspots again, because he would have to use this.
I see. Yeah, I think if you smeared the whole thing uniformly with flour, you'd be less likely to get a hotspot problem than if you tried to use a hot bronze or something like that.
Okay. And Bob, I know you mentioned something about bright spots being on the mustache.
Yes.
Did you want to go over did you guys want to discuss that? What's that about? Because that would violate this uniformity as well.
Yes, there are, depending on whether you're looking at the negative or positive image, there's either dark spots or bright spots on the mustache, which is interesting. I think it's worthwhile to try and ask the question, what would cause that? And what I found in my image hypothesis, that's caused by hairs on the mustache that would be standing up vertically from the face, acting as essentially as little lightning rods during the electrostatic process that resulted from the charged particles.
Oh yeah.
So there is a mechanism for that. Yes, and I see, looking at this little figurine here, it's almost 6 inches. It's maybe 5.9 inches high, which would be 150 millimeters.
Okay.
Yeah.
High. Are you sharing your screen? Trying to share your screen, Bob? Or
I'm not. I was just looking at the figure that Hugh showed before.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. All right.
Because on one side of this little figurine, there is a tape measure, and it's
No,
almost, yeah.
He's 15 centimeters high ish. Yeah.
But
Okay.
yeah,
So Hugh seems to be
15 centimeters, about 15 centimeters high, 150 millimeters.
So Hugh,
Yeah.
you seem to be agreeing that actually, Colin's method wouldn't account for body image uniformity because there would be this issue of bright spots or hot spots, especially on the mustache, which is an interesting thing. I've never heard that aspect before. So.
Oh no, that's Bob noticing bright spots on the Shroud moustache.
So
Not that's nothing to do with Colin.
What would you dispute this as a factor in terms of Colin's method then, or like what do you make of the bright spots on the mustache that Bob's making here?
I don't know. I'm just trying to find a copy of it so I can look at the bright spots myself. I suspect that they are irregularities in the weave rather than actual failures on the than they are discharges from electrostatically flung out, or indeed atomically vertically flung out whiskers.
Okay.
But I'll have to look at it closely to find out.
Okay. Yeah, I notice here in looking at this image, this 15 centimeter high image, and then looking at the image compared with the figurine, there are many things that are not shown on the image. None of the coloration differences are shown. For example, on the arms and the shoulders, there's yellow. That's not shown on the image. There's looks like a silver kind of a broken circle on his chest. That's not shown. There's different colors on his face and around the eyes, and those colors aren't shown at all. So that that the process of making the image by roasted flour and oil did not preserve any of the coloration, so that some of the things that would have been on the body on the shroud similarly did not show up because of the mechanism that produced the images on the shroud.
Okay. So
I see. Well, I was suggesting that if the little red man with his silver mark on the chest didn't produce any equivalent signage on the image, but I wouldn't expect it to just using flour and water, and I wouldn't necessarily expect it to using radiation of any kind. And I think you draw up an interesting point, which is that following the radiation hypothesis, even if it's whether it's a electromagnetic or a subatomic radiation, the radiation does seem to be remarkably uniform from hair, lips, fingers, and so on, even coins, if there are such things, on the eyes, fairly indiscriminately, which is quite strange because the substrate from which the radiation is coming is so different.
One thing I wanted to ask you guys, in terms of the vertically mapped wrapping distortions, because how would Colin's method do on that front? One thing that is important is, again, he's not even using a bas-relief and stuff like that. So, yeah,
we can see on his face that he hasn't smeared his cloth down to around the cheeks. It's literally gone across. We've got the sides of the eyebrows, and then we've got the nose, and we've got the chin. But he hasn't folded it down over the cheeks or anything. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't transfer well, I have to say, to a 3D plot. So just to keep Bob amused, I'm going to show you this.
Oh, okay. I'll stop sharing.
Oh, sorry. Are you sharing?
I was just showing the face that you were talking about, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, you're going to love this.
And And Bob, I take it in terms of the vertically mapped wrapping distortion, you would say obviously Colin's method fails on that front as Hugh's bringing up his.
So this is Colin's face, almost as we said. It's just a screen grab from his picture, but you'll see that I've loaded it into ImageJ's interactive 3D surface plot. And one of the interesting things about this and the VP8 image analyzer is that you can easily be distracted by looking at the original colors. And it's quite important that we remove the original colors so that all we can see is a gray scale. Similarly, I'm going to increase the grid size so that we're looking at it very small. Now, you might think that there we've got a reasonably good 3D image. I mean, it's not, we've got a terrible hole that seems to have two instead of one, but the upper lip or the line between the two lips seems to be fairly reasonable. The eyebrows certainly bulge out reasonably. So at first glance, we might say, well, that's not too bad. However, if we start looking at it sideways on, we'll notice that it becomes, even if I smooth it off slightly, it becomes completely meaningless.
And Hugh, we've got an audience question about ImageJ here that I think is relevant at this point. So
yeah,
Teddy, does the more modern ImageJ software quote unquote fill in gaps? So, you know, such as how software for photographs can fill in certain areas and stuff, and does it use artificial intelligence and that sort of thing? So no, it doesn't. But I will, if we take every single particle of the smallest resolution that ImageJ will look at, you can see that the thing looks like a forest of tiny spikes. And this applies to the shroud as well, or anything which is made of linen particles, because each little crest of the thread has got its own different brightness. So what we have to do is to smooth it slightly, which does automatically fill in gaps. And you can see we can fill it in very slightly, and we still end up with, in this particular case, with something which is, to my mind, completely meaningless. But with the little blue fellow, or red fellow as he was, he looks considerably more three-dimensional. Okay. Yeah, Bob, what's your take about the vertically mapped wrapping distortions? And obviously we've kind of covered the three-dimensionality here, but
let's see if I can get
I'll
just get out of that and then we'll go into something else.
Do you think Colin's method could account for this feature, this vertical encodation only?
Well, I guess I'm having trouble just in the my thinking process here. I'm having trouble coming up with or identifying exactly how a roasting process of flour and oil on a figurine would transfer three-dimensional information. And it might be possible to an extent, but exactly how that would be the case, I'm not exactly sure. I would like to be able to identify a mechanism for that to happen.
Gotcha.
It doesn't look real good, but there might be a little bit of a 3D effect there, but it's not very good.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Okay.
So that's a very good question, because I'm not sure either. It seems to be related to the amount of flour which has been transferred from the object to the cloth. As far as I can make out, there doesn't seem to be anything else. There doesn't seem to be anything else. That's all I can see. So it's related entirely to an amount of flour that's been translated across. And,
the other thing that I'd like to say would be that you have to realize here that he's gone through what about 11 or 12 years of research
Yeah,
on this. So I'm not sure. Has he gone through dozens, maybe hundreds of different experiments on this?
at least dozens. Yeah.
So that he would be reevaluating how he could change things in order to make it better. Okay.
Exactly.
And so it's not just the fact of let's just try it once and see if it works. No, you're doing an iterative process here to make it better. And one way in which you could make it better would be to put more flour and oil on the high points, thus essentially creating a 3D effect. But it would be due to the involvement of intelligence to do it.
Gotcha. Okay. One thing I think is really important here to get your guys' take on is this issue of superficiality. Because Bob, you mentioned this up a couple times. It fails on multiple levels. Also, no capillary flow is evident on the shroud, and Colin's method here would produce these results. Now, just before, first of all, before I get into my follow-up question, Hugh, I take it you do agree with Bob's take that Colin's method fails to account for superficiality and the non-capillarity. Sorry.
Not only that, but I mean, I agree. It's grotesque that he seems to think that all the interstices of the web of the woven cloth are packed with this sort of solid glue which holds it all together. And he writes glue in his article several times and in capital letters.
Yep, solidified glue.
Yeah. Well, I certainly agree with Bob. There's no possible suggestion that any pictures of the shroud look as though they've got glue holding them together. I mean, I will say that when people say there's no sign of capillarity, I'm not sure upon which where have they been looking for signs of capillarity?
Well,
you can't tell from the sticky tape samples because they're just surface detritus. You wouldn't expect to see any capillarity there. The only place where you might expect to see it is in the Mark Evans photographs. And certainly I can't see anything that looks like capillary action there, but then I don't know what it would look like if it was there.
If there was, you stick a thread into a bottle of Coke and it soaks up into the thread.
I know what capillarity is.
Due to capillarity, it's drawn up because of the force of attraction up between the different fibers in the thread. And so it colors all of the fibers in the thread. But on the shroud, we only have the surface 2 or 3 fibers that are discolored. Thus, there's no capillarity.
Not necessarily. I mean, obviously, the blood goes all the way through the shroud and comes out the other side.
Yeah, but we're talking about the image. There's no capillarity in the image.
But there's the capillarity. The blood also doesn't penetrate the threads. We've got the observations of the 1973 commission who took a thread apart and noticed that the blood itself was only on the outside of each thread. So the capillarity is between the threads. It's not necessarily within the threads, even with something as liquid as the blood. So the fact that the shroud image doesn't penetrate the thread doesn't necessarily mean that it is any less capillaceous.
There's no capillarity there. There's no capillarity, the mechanism that caused the image.
I have yet to see evidence that there's no capillarity. I mean, obviously it's difficult
because only the top 2 or 3 layers of fibers are discolored. You don't on the shroud, the central fibers are not discolored. If the top 2 or 3 fibers were discolored by a chemical in water, that water would have been drawn across all of the fibers in that thread.
No, that's not true, because the blood, for example, which does go all the way through, does not penetrate the thread.
No, just
all right.
Did you say that correctly?
Yes, the blood does not penetrate the threads upon which it is sitting. It goes between the threads and out the other side, but it does not penetrate the threads. This was observed in 1973.
One thing, in terms of the non-capillary, there's also no cementation, and Teddy's saying there's no evidence of flour or oxidized oil.
How do you know there's no cementation
on the shroud?
Yeah.
Well, it's one of the minimal relevant features that Stirp discovered, that there was no cementation between the body and fibers.
Quote their results. How do they know there's no cementation? How would you tell yourself whether there was cementation between on a piece of cloth?
Well, you look at it with a high-powered microscope.
Yeah.
You can't see whether it's glued together with a high-powered microscope unless you could actually see the glue. I mean, they did pick at it with needles. They did peck at it with needles, and I think they didn't observe much cementation there, but I don't know how much they picked at it. What they certainly couldn't observe whether there was or wasn't cementation was simply by looking at the sticky tape slides, for example, because they only pulled off surface debris anyway and would have pulled any cementation apart. I think there's a lot of things that we think of as sort of gospel statements, and when you look at, as I'm afraid I do, rather like Teddy in a way, but in a different thing, look at every single statement and say, how do you know? And suddenly you go, well, basically, we looked at, and it's by looking at Mark Evans's pictures where you can't tell one way or the other. So, I mean, I've seen no evidence that there's no cementation. I don't think there is any cementation, but there's no evidence for it. The blood doesn't seem to cement anything together.
So just before Bob comes in, just to clarify what Hugh is doing here, and my follow-up is going to be on superficiality, which Hugh does accept, but on the no cementation, he's admitting, yes, empirically, we have proven there is no evidence of cementation on the thing. But he's saying, but that's just because there's no evidence today. That doesn't mean they were never in the past. Maybe there was cementation, but their methods.
No, I don't think we've proved that there's no cementation today.
Okay, so Bob, I'll let you come in then.
Who has taken a shroud fiber and pulled it apart? That's the only way you could possibly tell that the two threads were not cemented together. And in fact, if we try and compare the fibers which have had blood all over them, and blood is unbelievably sticky. If there was any cementation going on, the blood would stick things together. But it doesn't appear to be that the fibers or the threads are any more cemented where the blood is than they are where the image is. So unless you can see a distinction in cementation between the blood and the image, not just a distinction in color, a distinction in cementation between the blood and the image, then I don't think you can easily say that there is no cementation.
Well, from my understanding, I'm going to go to Bob, but just very quickly, my understanding is that the Stirp team members did examine for the cementation between the threads and within the microfibers within a fiber, and according Heller and Adler even used a teasing needle to check for the cementation there. But I do want, Bob's been raising his hand for a while, so Bob, over to you. What's your response?
Well, yeah, I'd like to back up here again. I thought I heard Hugh say that the evidence on the shroud regarding the blood was that it did not soak between the fibers on a thread.
Correct.
Did I understand you correctly?
Yes.
Well, when I think about it, if we have wet blood, recent blood, it's still wet, and if I put one thread into that wet blood, I would expect that it to draw up in that one thread between the fibers. That's what I would expect. And are you saying that would not occur?
I am quoting the 1973 Turin Commission, which pulled apart, actually cut out from the shroud small fibers, and noticed that on pieces of thread identified as blood, the blood manifests itself as granules which have wicked their way around the thread without penetrating into the central fibers. Now, that's what was discovered by people who actually took blood-soaked fibers and pulled them apart. Now, none of the STURP team have done that or did that. So they're not in a position to say from direct observation whether the blood itself goes into the thread or not. But the 1973 Commission were in that position, did do that experiment, and that's what they found.
Okay, so I would take both of that. I'd take that evidence at face value, because my process here is to follow the evidence where it leads.
Yep.
But I would also believe that if I stuck a single thread into wet blood, that it would soak into up into that thread between the fibers. So I take both of those as true. So therefore, the image for the blood, how the blood went from the body to the cloth has to be consistent with the evidence, which I've not really worked on yet.
No, but you have suggested that it wasn't wet. Your own hypothesis is that it's not wet, which I think is a splendid hypothesis and would certainly account for the fact that the blood doesn't show capillarity, because you suspect that it was pushed there by neutron radiation. No,
not well. Particle radiation, both protons and neutrons. Mm-hmm. They would naturally thrust the blood off the body that had dried on the body. It naturally would.
Okay, so Hugh, just answer this. I think this is a question from Mr. Jetty for you, and very quickly, because I do want to get into the superficiality specifically. But yes, what's the difference between cementation and cementation residue? If there was no residue, how could there be cementation?
That's a very good question, and entirely correct. Perhaps there is cement residue. I mean, if there is cementation, then it's probably because the things are held together with some kind of what we might call glue, and therefore that glue would be visible if you extracted it.
Okay, and Bob, anything that you wanted to say to this question, or no?
No.
Okay, so one of the things, Hugh has been questioning some of the aspects. Now, I know that Hugh does accept body image superficiality, and this is a reason to reject Colin Berry's method. Now, Colin Berry, he disagrees with Bob and Hugh, and he says, well, superficiality isn't a fact either. So I just wanted to turn it over to you guys. How do we know that there is this body image superficiality, and we can use this as a means for refuting Colin Berry's hypothesis?
All we've got to go on essentially is the Mark Evans micrographs. I don't think there's been sufficient investigation of individual threads to be able to suggest superficiality in any other way. What it would have been very useful, and for all I know the Italians have done it, would be to take the threads which they cut out both in 1973 and just before the STURP team did their work in 1978, and either embed them in microscopic wax, or even just glue them to the side of a block or something like that, slice them off and look down vertically onto a transverse edge, so you could actually see all the little fibers. And in that sense, you would then be able to tell whether the whereabouts the image actually is, whether it's on just one side, whether it goes all the way around, and all the rest of each fiber. Now, in the absence of that, all we can do is look at the Mark Evans micrographs. And from there, we can certainly see that in any particular thread, some of the fibers appear to be colored, some of them don't appear to be colored, some of them are colored along a small part of their length, but not the whole length. Some of them, the coloration disappears into crevices between the overlapping threads and so on. But there seems to be enough uncolored fibers visible even on image threads for us to suppose that you couldn't have the image going just down through that one particular, in a sort of layer underneath that one thread. That's what leads me to suspect that the image is truly superficial.
Okay, Bob, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? Because Colin Berry just denies superficiality outright. Yeah.
Yeah, he doesn't address the evidence and explain why he thinks that the evidence is incorrect, however.
Well, I've only been working on the Shroud for 10 years here, and if I was working on the Shroud for 1,000 years, I might be able to go back and reinvent the wheel on everything and have everything at my fingertips here. But at some point, I like to try and make progress on understanding the Shroud of Turin. And in order to make progress on the Shroud of Turin, I have to have a starting point. And so my starting point is the general consensus of Shroud researchers. And these are smart people. I think they're trying to do the best job that they can. And I'm not accusing them of being deceptive in any way. I think they're trying to do the best job that they can. And so when they come together and they prepare a consensus of scientific characteristics of the Shroud images, as Giulio Fonte and his team have done, then I take that as significant that I really don't need at this point, unless there's some issue comes up regarding a particular point, that I don't really need to go back and reinvent the wheel, so to speak. That I can just, I can stand on the shoulders of giants, previous giants, and I can reach a little bit higher that way in making progress on better understanding the Shroud of Turin. So that's my approach.
Awesome. All right, cool. So I have a couple questions on things that we haven't even addressed. So the first thing I want to ask about, okay, well, I'll reverse that, because let's stick with the body image. Now, Bob has mentioned something that, Bob has mentioned that there are images of bones and teeth. And this would definitely rule out Colin Berry's, as well as the Scorch hypothesis. So, did you, Hugh, did you want to go back and forth with Bob a bit about the bones images?
I don't think Bob specifically mentioned teeth, but perhaps he would be able to. A little while ago, I had a discussion about this, I think it might have been on the Shroud Science Guild website, so I don't want to be too exposing about it, because people tend to be it's a confidential website, but I entered into some correspondence with a dentist saying, can you show me where these teeth are? And they sent me 2 pictures, both of which were pictures of the mouth area of the Shroud, and they both had the teeth outlined in black. And they were both in 2 completely different places. So I pointed that out, and I said, you've sent me 2 pictures which are actually mutually contradictory. The teeth are in different places. Can you tell me where you think those teeth are? And I never heard from them again. I know Alan Wanger in his book says you can see 32 teeth. I think that's nonsense. I can't see any teeth at all. And what's more, if I ask somebody, please send me a picture of the mouth of the Shroud and mark in where these teeth are, no one has yet been able to do that. I mean, it's a fairly simple thing to do. You can get a big, massive blow-up picture of the mouth, just sort of print it out, get a pen, go there, 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 there. It's just not possible, which makes me feel, well, at least no one's done it. So, which makes me feel that the idea that there might be teeth there is an interesting one, but it's not demonstrated by actual evidence.
Yeah. Okay. On my emails, I probably sent out 20 pictures of where the teeth are. So, I don't know. You don't see them. I do. Now, the difference here is that when you're looking at the mouth area, you see a pattern. And I hope you can see the pattern.
Yes.
You see the pattern of vertical dark versus light areas. You see your pattern. So now, are we looking at teeth as if we were looking at a person's teeth in reflected light? Well, no, the images weren't made by reflected light. They again, what you're looking at depends on the means by which the images were formed. Now, when I say that you can look at the mouth area and you can see teeth, what I mean by that is that you can see alternating light and dark areas vertically oriented, just as teeth would be, that are not located anywhere else on the shroud. I've challenged people to send me pictures of where else on the shroud, if you're claiming that the teeth area is just due to the interaction of the fabric, why do we only see them where the mouth is located and we don't see them anywhere else? If you know of anywhere else on the front or dorsal images, please inform me as to where that pattern occurs. Therefore, I think that what we are seeing is teeth, the effect of teeth there. Now, it's not in reflected light. It could be teeth creating what's called in physics an interference pattern, which is interesting. So that this would be the case that particles, as my image formation hypothesis has it, that there would be particles of protons and neutrons being vertically collimated as they're emitted from within the body. Now, it appears as though the lips on the shroud are widened. So it'd be like that, probably due to the crucifixion process, probably in pain and dehydration, so that we're having a direct effect of the teeth on the cloth, not going through the lips, because the lips are retracted. That's what I see taking place. But what we see in the vertical lines of alternating light and bright areas, only in the teeth area, may indeed be an interference pattern of the particles going through the teeth. So that adds a little bit more explanation. You know, when I say that I see teeth, that's what I mean.
And Bob, just before Hugh comes back, also, because it's not just the teeth, there's also bones. Do you want to tell the audience a bit about that? Like, what do you mean bone? What is this issue about bones as well?
Yes, when you're looking at the hands, you're not actually looking at the fingers. You're looking at the bones and the underneath the skin in the hand portion. That would be down here, so that the wound is going through the wrist down here, and this area is not showing fingers. It's showing bones underneath the skin, so that I think that bones are also apparent on portions of the backbone. I've had a medical doctor point that out to me, where on the backbone you could see the effect of the bones in the backbone. There's also been reports of the, and I haven't read this, but I understand that in someone's paper, they've indicated that they could identify the separation of the different bones in the skull. Mm-hmm. So I would submit all of those for consideration.
All right, cool. Hugh, you can give your response to teeth, but also, what's your take on the bones? Because I don't think I've ever had you respond to that as well.
I don't think they're there at all. And I would yet to see somebody mark out exactly where they think these things are. Now, if we take this, can you see this picture of teeth? Am I sharing some teeth with you? Can you?
Yep, it's up there now.
Yeah, this blue picture here contains the negative of the shroud, and somebody has marked on it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 teeth. Yeah. And here at the top, I've got somebody else's version of teeth and somebody else's version of teeth. And in the middle, I've got an interesting variety. I've got 3 different versions all piled on top of each other. Now, we don't even know where the mouth is, let alone where the teeth is. Where the red circles are is somebody's idea of where the teeth are. And where the blue circles are, somebody else's idea of where the teeth are. Now, it may be that Bob has an absolute correct idea and can specify precisely where they are. But I think the fact that so many people can see teeth, and when you ask them where they are, they all come up with a completely different idea is a pretty good suggestion that there are, in fact, no teeth there at all. They are illusions. Now, the black and white striations, which are up and down the shroud all the way, are variations in the colors of the warp threads, I think, and have nothing whatever to do with separation between teeth.
Go show me where that pattern occurs elsewhere on the body then.
I think if I probably took almost anywhere, I mean, if I, oh no, I'll go back to where I won't there. We can find areas of light and dark warp threads immediately above and immediately below. That's why people think that they can find these teeth up in as far as the nose and down into the beard.
Why aren't the alternating light and dark areas horizontal instead of exactly vertical?
Because it's the vertical threads that are mostly visible on the image side of the shroud. I expect if you turn the shroud upside down and look closely there, you'd find the teeth horizontally.
Okay, if you could show me somewhere else on the shroud, front or dorsal image, where that pattern occurs, I might be convinced of it.
Light and dark. I shall see what I can find. I'll make a note.
Yes, because the location of that appearance is very important. It occurs exactly where the teeth would be found, and that is just below the mustache. Now, you have to realize that some of the photographs of the face image show the teeth better than other photographs. So if you take a photograph that doesn't show the teeth well, you can get a variety of opinion where the teeth might be located. But if you show a group of people a photograph, a good photograph of where the teeth are that actually shows it, then I think you'd have a good concurrence of opinion on it.
But you don't. I have tried this over and over again, and people keep going, the teeth are here, and they cannot actually.
I don't know what photographs you're showing them.
Okay.
Oh.
I see in the comment Teddy's saying she's got a picture, so when that comes in, I'll put that up. But yeah. Okay. While we're waiting for that, I want to ask you, because we've avoided something that is, I think, critically important. Look, there's not just body images on this thing. There are blood stains too. And what I want to know is how does the formation of the blood stains, given a Scorch method and given Colin Berry's, roasted, toasted method, or whatever you call it, for example, if the blood stains were put on the shroud first, as many pro-shroud experts claim has been proven given the evidence, well, then this Scorch method we would have torched blood stains. They would be damaged, altered, and thermally degraded, I think is the technical word. But also, how would if the blood stains, the images were formed first through this Scorch method, and the blood stains were applied afterwards through a painting thing? Well, the blood stains wouldn't get rid of the Scorch. The cloth would still be underneath. The body images would be under. So I want to turn it to you guys. Once we put the body images through Scorches, how would that relate to putting on the blood stains afterwards? Could they be reconciled in some way? And yeah, Bob, I'll start with you first on the. Oh, Hugh. Okay, Hugh, you can go first.
Let Hugh go first.
Okay. Oh, no, I was simply say that no, you certainly couldn't put the blood stains on first and then scorch the shroud afterwards. I don't think that's at all possible. However, I think the blood stains were certainly applied afterwards. I think it's just possible using the printing method, which I've myself advocated. It's just possible that you could put the blood stains on and then put the cloth over the top. But in general, I don't think that there is sufficient evidence to suggest that the blood stains were put on before the image. I think that the evidence that has been presented has been disputed by other authenticists who've also looked at the same thing. In particular, the Nature and Adler and Heller looked at a lot of these little fibers, and they described them as successively corroded. I think they specifically used the word corroded starting with the non-image fibers, which were hardly corroded at all, through to Scorch fibers, which are heavily corroded. Well, I've looked at hundreds of these little fibers because they're all on the photographs taken by Eugenia Nitowski and Joseph Kolbeck. And I can't find all this corrosion that Heller and Adler say they've seen. And neither did Eugenia Nitowski, sister, can't remember what she became a nun. But she also couldn't find this corrosion. So I'm not sure what the corrosion was that they thought they'd observed, that they thought was not present underneath the bloodstains, but was present in areas where there was image. And the other point, so corollary to that, I've been trying to reconcile these two observations, and that is that the blood certainly occupied in any particular patch. There's a lot more of the shroud that was blood than was image. If you took any individual square centimeter of the shroud, even in an intense image area, there's actually not a lot of image there. I mean, a lot of the surface fibrils are not affected by the image. This is part of the, what do people call it? The halftone effect. But there would be blood over all of them. So there's a fair chance that most of the, well, there's a good chance that many of the fibers which had blood on them didn't have any image on them in the first place. Which may be why they looked like non-image fibers, because in fact, most of the fibers on the shroud, most of the fibers, not the threads, most of the fibers on the shroud are non-image fibers. Right across the body, there are more in any particular, say, I don't know, square centimeter, even in an area of intense image, there are more non-image fibers than there are image fibers.
Mm-hmm.
So if you then slosh blood on top of that, the blood is far more of the blood is going to be on top of a non-image fiber than it is going to be on top of an image fiber. I think that's a point that people don't think about very often.
So before I go over to Bob, just to clarify, so if you're saying the bloodstains were, so the body images were scorched on, meaning
no, I don't think they were scorched on, but however they were produced.
Well, for today's episode's about the Scorch hypothesis. Yeah. So let's assume what the Shroud skeptics want, either Colin Berry or the Scorch. Then it would be continuous scorches, even where the bloodstains are. If they were painted on afterwards, we would still have the body image scorched zone underneath that thing. So that would disprove that they were ever scorched, regardless of. If you take that the bloodstains were painted on afterwards, we would have that to falsify it. But if you take the bloodstains were painted on first, then the body images were scorched, well, that can't be true either, because there would be thermal degradation of the bloodstains going in that heat. So you would agree with that. This is a falsification of these Scorch methods, that either way, regardless of the bloodstains on first or the bloodstains on afterwards, because we can falsify that the Scorch methods can explain the body images and the bloodstain evidence. Is that correct?
No, not really, because I mean, if the Scorch image, I mean, we're somewhat theoretical here because we've all agreed we don't think it's a Scorch. But if the Scorch was able to reproduce the image as we see it, then you could put blood on top of it, and any particular fiber would have whatever is underneath the blood would be the Scorch, or would be the degraded cellulose. Now, I don't think that enough blood fibers have been examined carefully enough to see whether there's degraded cellulose underneath them or not. Certainly, the corrosion which Heller and Adler thought they could see has not been observed by the few other people who have had access to the same photomicrographs.
Okay. So what you're saying, I'll go to Bob after this because I know he's trying to say something, but and I want his take on this. So what you're saying, we can with the evidence we have, according to you, we can falsify that the bloodstains were put on first and then the body image is scorched, because that would be evident with the bloodstains being damaged.
Yeah.
But we can't falsify the bloodstains being painted on afterwards because we haven't tested enough of the blood samples to prove there aren't scorched images underneath them.
Yeah,
that's your position.
That's my position.
Okay. Yeah, Bob. So over to you. What do you make of incorporating the bloodstains, given we assume one of these scorching methods was used?
Yes. Well, I guess the point here is that Colin Berry's hypothesis doesn't discuss the blood. So his hypothesis is inadequate because it doesn't discuss the blood or the scourge marks, for example. So it's just another one of the many different inadequacies of the hypothesis. Now, in general, the cloth, the image is modeled. Now, as Hugh said, in that modeling of the top 2 or 3 image fibers in the threads, the modeling in any particular, let's say, square centimeter, is mostly non-discolored fibers. So the modeling of the image results in the majority of the fibers not being discolored. Nevertheless, with blood splattered, in various locations across the square centimeter, you could tell where the nature of how the discoloration appears in any area of the modeling where it is discolored. So that if blood were covering over or in the same location as part of one modeled section of fibers, and you then remove that blood either by scraping or by a chemical process and looked underneath it, the evidence evidently, as I understand it, is that the discoloration on those fibers that was underneath the blood is not present. And so therefore, they reason that the blood was put on first, and then whatever effect discolored the fibers was later. Okay, now in my, but so the real evidence is that there were lack of discolored fibers underneath the blood, and the interpretation is that the blood was put on first, followed by the discoloration. But I don't think we should necessarily say that it's been proven that the blood was put on first. In my hypothesis for image formation, for example, they'd be simultaneous. They'd be essentially simultaneous within the same nanosecond as the blood was transported from the body to the cloth. It's probably also true that the discolored fibers did not immediately appear as discolored. Okay, testing by Art Lind has, I think, indicates that the discoloration due to, for example, proton irradiation is what he tested on. That after proton irradiation of linen cloth, that he had to bake the cloth that had already been proton irradiated in the oven at certain temperatures for a certain amount of time in order to obtain a discoloration. So that the concept here is that the images would probably not have formed immediately, whereas the blood would have been there immediately. So that the presence of the blood would have had an effect on the continuing effect of the discoloration. Okay, so that you could have them arrive simultaneously and yet end up with a situation where you have blood that prevented the discoloration of the fibers. That's my position. So I think there's still flexibility in that. And we should not just assume that the blood was put on first, followed then at some later point by whatever caused the discoloration.
Awesome. All right, cool. And yeah, so Teddy sent me her picture, but Hugh, just to get you on the record and stuff like that. So I know that you dispute the fact that there's no body images under the bloodstains, but let's assume with the majority of scholars that it is a fact for the sake of argument. My criticism of the Scorch hypothesis would then apply, because we would expect to see scorched body images under the bloodstains, like just painting bloodstains would not take away. So, okay, if it's a fact, that falsifies it. Okay, and I'll just quickly show up Teddy's images of the teeth, and then, okay, share for people, because he was asking for a good image.
Yeah.
So here's Teddy's.
Ooh, brilliant. Isn't that lovely? Right, I can't actually see that she has outlined any teeth at all.
It's so this is like the bottom lip.
Yes.
And the teeth are up here. Here are the lower teeth.
Yeah. Can we actually outline where the teeth are? It seems to me that we've got two little bright spots just above the upturning. That's those two little bright spots there. Now, are they either side of a tooth or in the middle of a tooth? Anyway, the area between them seems to be fairly light coloured. And then the area immediately to the left of them is dark coloured. Is that meant to be a tooth or a hole in a tooth? And then we go along a bit further and we get to a light coloured stripe, a very thin tooth perhaps. Then we get a dark patch. Then we get a light patch, dark patch, light patch. I can see alternating light and dark bands there. I would have great difficulty in actually describing any one of them as actually being a tooth. I mean, if you can see teeth, you've got to be able to put a line in between each one. And can we send that back to Teddy and ask her to put lines in between the teeth rather than just a vague idea as to where the mouth might be?
Okay.
And realize that you might be looking at an interference pattern rather than teeth as in reflected light.
Gotcha. All right, cool. So yeah, if Teddy sends that, I will post that up in the blog. But at this point,
to say I want a picture of some teeth and then somebody sends me a picture of a smile is just not the same thing at all. Teeth look like this. I want whoever's watching this show to send me a picture which looks like this. All right, that's what teeth look like, and that's what I'd like to see. And maybe if you think they're incisors, we can have one like that.
Okay, actually, yeah, Teddy did.
Canines, rather.
Okay, so Teddy has sent me that, a better picture. Yep. So yeah, I'll spend the time to bring that up. Okay, so here's her first picture. These are the bottom teeth, it looks like.
No, those would be the top teeth.
The top teeth, okay.
I could just see a bunch of wiggly lines. How many teeth have you got there? Just can you bring it up to full screen or something like that?
It's on my Gmail, so I.
Okay, well, no, don't bother. But include it in your your comments afterwards.
There's 3 photos, so.
No, that's just a mouth.
Okay,
that's
doesn't
got any teeth at all.
I think this is her point that the mouth this is the shape of the mouth, but yeah, this is the teeth. Okay, I'll post that up on my blog, and you guys can go back and forth on that. But
it's hilarious.
All right, so cool. So I think I've covered all the main points in terms of evaluating the traditional Scorch as well as Colin Berry's updated Toastograph or Roastograph or film set Model 10, whatever you call it. It's obviously a false hypothesis. It fails on several fronts. Now, I just want to go to each of my guests. Is there anything, I'll start with Bob this time. Is there anything I missed that you think is really important to discuss with Hugh?
I can't think of anything else. No, we've been at this for about 2 hours and 45 minutes at this point. So
okay,
that's probably enough at this point, I think.
Sounds good. Hugh, is there anything that we missed that you really want to talk about that's important about these Scorch techniques?
No, I don't think so. I think we've covered everything there is to be said about them. And in general, as I say, I think I'll get back to you. I'll dig up some of my old Scorches and see whether they still fluoresce under ultraviolet light. I wonder if the ultraviolet fluorescence sort of fades away with time.
Yes. Send that to me. I'll post it up in the blog as like attachments for people as well. So, all right, cool. Well, yeah, I just want to say thank you guys so much for taking the time to do this. As I said, I think it's important because even though Colin Berry's method is a failure in my view, I do think it's the best of the ordinary artistic mechanism. So it was important to get the refutations out there, why it doesn't work and that sort of thing in terms of explaining the shroud images. So yeah, thank both of you guys. And I promise next time I'm going to do a panel review on the radiation hypotheses proper. So the whole time will be spent discussing Bob Rucker.
The ultraviolet radiation or the particle radiation?
Yep. I'm going to have Mark Antonacci involved in that as well. And maybe, I don't know if does Paulo de Lazaro speak English well or see it?
He writes it well, but I don't know whether he speaks it. Yes. Be interesting to get him and Christophe Donnet, who's the Frenchman, and they can discuss whether ultraviolet or infrared produces a better image. Gotcha.
Okay. So yeah, I'll work that out. The next panel reviews will definitely be on the radiation. So I'll have both of you guys back for that. And
sure.
Yeah. All right, sounds good. So have a great week, everybody. And
do you want a little bit of breaking news?
Sure.
In 2 weeks' time, I'm going to spend a week in the British Museum.
Okay.
I've booked a research period. I'm going to look through all those stacks of documents that they've got on the 1988 carbon dating.
Oh, nice. Okay, so Bob will be interested in your findings on that front. So awesome. Yeah. All right, cool. Well, have a great week, everybody. Happy New Year. And thanks to Teddy and Mr. Jetty and Ringo Cat in the audience. You guys gave some great comments and posts. So have a great week. Take care.
Okay.
Okay, goodbye.
All right, I've hit